Defied. Tired today. I'm going to give it the best I can. We're going to talk today about the PCR test. I've had a lot of people in my personal life who have had to use the test, and they've asked me about what are the questions around the legitimacy of the PCR test, and I try to explain to them what cycle threshold is. And it seems to me it's a major part of the puzzle that's missing, that I think pretty much everybody can understand the problem with the PCR test after they understand cycle threshold. But I wanted to start it out today with something funny to kind of lighten the mood. I'm sure you guys know who this guy is here, Owen Benjamin. He's been blackballed from, all of the platforms, all of them. But I still track him down and I watch his streams because he's hilarious, and this really had me laughing earlier today.
This is what would happen if the internet stopped. This is life with the internet, and then this is what would happen if the internet stopped working. Oh, I guess we're cool now. Oh, no way. Oh, comment section, comment section, comment section.
I thought that was funny. That's exactly how the internet works, right? But today we're talking about cycle threshold. Something a lot less interesting. Or a lot less fun. Way more interesting. We're going to start out with this article called "Faith in a Quick Test Leads to the Epidemic That Wasn't." And what this story is about is it's about an epidemic that they thought had a breakout of, the whooping cough, in 2006, I think it was. This article's written in 2007. And it's important to read the article and go through the whole thing because of not just the PCR test, but because of the psychology around what happened at the institution. So, Dr. Brooke Heron, an internist at Dartmouth Hitchcock Medical Center, could not stop coughing. For 2 weeks, starting in mid-April last year, she coughed, seemingly nonstop, followed by another week when she coughed sporadically. Annoyingly, she said, everyone who worked with her. Before long, Dr. Catherine Kirkland, an infectious disease specialist at Dartmouth, had a chilling thought. Could she be seeing the start of a whooping cough epidemic? By late April, other healthcare workers at the hospital were coughing, and severe, intraceable coughing. A severe, intraceable coughing is a whooping cough hallmark. And if it was whooping cough, the epidemic had to be contained immediately because the disease could be deadly to babies in the hospital and could lead to pneumonia in the frail and vulnerable. It was the start of a bizarre episode at the medical center. The story of the epidemic that wasn't. For months, nearly everyone involved thought the medical center had a huge whooping cough outbreak with extensive ramifications. Nearly 1,000 healthcare workers at the hospital in Lebanon, New Hampshire, were given a preliminary test and furloughed from work until their results were in. 142 people, including Dr. Herden, were given antibiotics and a vaccine for protection. Hospital beds were taken out of commission, including some in intensive care. Then about 8 months later, healthcare workers were dumbfounded to receive an email message from the hospital administration informing them that the whole thing was a false alarm. Not a single case of whooping cough was confirmed with the definitive test, growing the bacterium, Bordetella pertussis, in a laboratory. So what they're saying is they took the test from the PCR that told everybody they had the whooping cough, and when they went and actually did cell cultures with those samples, they were unable to grow any of the bacteria that caused the whooping cough. Instead, it appears the healthcare workers probably were afflicted with an ordinary respiratory disease like the common cold. Now, the thing that's crazy about this to me is these are infectious disease experts. These aren't just random folks that thought they had a cough and got a test, and so then they really thought they had a cough. No, these were infectious disease experts, and they were completely fooled by the PCR test. Why were they fooled by the PCR test? Well, I'll let Kary Mullis explain to you exactly why. First, he's going to talk about cell culture biology.
Eventually sweep across the planet and kill everybody. PCR came along right about the same time that HIV did, and it was in at CETUS that people started looking with PCR for HIV. That was the only way to see it, except for culture, which was a long, protracted procedure, which a lot of times didn't turn up the right. The results there weren't very good either.
Be contaminated.
Oh, the cultures, the whole method, that cell biology is a bunch of magic half the time, and those culture, the people that say they can do quantitative estimations of HIV from cultures are just they're fooling themselves.
So that's what Dr. Kary Mullis thought about cell culture, even. And the next thing I wanted to show you was that whenever the lockdowns and all of the restrictions came into being, the announcement was done with the WHO, and he said this simple phrase right here. We have a simple message for all countries: test, test, test. And that was because they were wanting to get this PCR test out there and get it prolific. Now, it's an interesting caveat that whenever the announcement was made for HIV/AIDS, something very similar was said.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First, the probable cause of AIDS has been found, a variant of a known human cancer virus. Second, not only has the agent been identified, but a new process has been developed to mass produce this virus.
So not only have they discovered this virus, but they've discovered at the exact same time a way to test for this virus that's never been done before.
Thirdly, with discovery of both the virus and this new process, we now have a blood test for AIDS. With the blood test, we can identify AIDS victims with essentially 100% certainty.
100% certainty. And that anytime anybody pays attention to science, they should worry about 100% certainty. Now, Kary Mullis was known for speaking out against that statement that was done whenever they announced HIV. So we've talked about this entire fake epidemic of whooping cough that was done throughout infectious disease experts in 2007. So if somebody were to study this, they would know that you could use the PCR test to cause a sort of epidemic, because this is what happened. People who just had regular respiratory illnesses or coughs assumed that they had whooping cough, and over 1,000 people were diagnosed. Now, the reason why the PCR test can be used in this way, or I would say misused in this way, is because of a variable in the PCR test called the cycle threshold values. If you don't report the cycle threshold values, then basically, just like Kary Mullis said, you can find just about anything in anything. And I will play that for you, what he thought about his own test, his own process that was then later changed into a test. Here we go.
The clip that Kary Mullis is talking about his PCR test and disease.
I want to ask this to Kary. How do they misuse PCR to estimate all these supposed free viral RNAs that may or may not be there?
I think misuse PCR is not quite. I don't think you can misuse PCR. The results, the interpretation of it. See, if you can say, if they could find this virus in you at all, And with PCR, if you do it well, you can find almost anything in anybody. It starts making you believe in the sort of Buddhist notion that everything is contained in everything else, right? I mean, because if you can amplify one single molecule up to something that you can really measure, which PCR can do, then there's just very few molecules that you don't have at least one single one of them in your body, okay? So that could be thought of as a misuse of it, just to claim that it's meaningful. But the real misuse of it is you don't need to test for HIV. You don't need to test for the other 10,000 retroviruses that are unnamed, also in the subject. Somebody that's got HIV generally is going to have almost anything that you can test for, because they have definitely been, HIV is a fairly rare virus. There's only 1 million of us out of 250, 300 million people in America that have that virus. So you have to get around, either your mother had to have it and pass it to you, or you have to really be paying a lot of attention to people that do have it, and paying only attention to them, and get a pretty good chance of getting it that way. It's hard to get it, but if you have it, there's a good chance you've also got a lot of other ones. Because you've been in the market where it's been possible for you to get a lot of, to test for that one and say that has any special meaning is what I think is the problem. Not that PCR has been misused. It's like, estimation.
So he obviously he won a Nobel Prize for inventing the PCR test, so he doesn't want to say that it's being misused, but he does, what he says is it's misinterpreted. You can use the PCR test to find just about any molecule in anybody, and that includes viral RNA. But the real misuse of it is to say that it's a significant thing that you found it there. Now, how does that tie back to cycle threshold? Well, the cycle threshold in a PCR test tells you how many passes they had to make, how many magnifications they had to do in order to find this piece of viral RNA, or this piece of RNA that they find in the PCR test. Now, the thing about the cycle threshold is it's directly inversely correlated to how much viral load you have. So if they only have to do, say, 10 to 15 cycles and they find this this piece of RNA, then there is the assumption that that person has a lot of it because they didn't have to do a lot of cycles to find it. But when you start getting into 30 to 35 or 40 cycles, first of all, Kary Mullis said that you should never be doing this test past those or into those levels. He said basically anything past 30 cycles, you're making things up at that point. And what you'll notice is that a lot of the PCR tests done in the United States were done at thresholds of 30 and above. Well, this guy wrote this article about it on Rational Ground, and it's probably the best way to explain it as we go along. So I'm just going to read parts of this to you. First, a quick review of the PCR test. Originally developed to detect the presence of DNA and RNA in biological samples. Even its Nobel-winning prize inventor Kary Mullis declared that PCR was never intended to diagnose a disease. It simply detects the presence of specific genetic material, which may or may not indicate infection. With every other disease, clinical symptoms are required for diagnosis. The jab trials required specific symptoms along with a positive test to flag someone as a CV case. Yet we are running millions of PCR tests worldwide on asymptomatic folks and quarantining them, this includes essential healthcare workers, if they test, quote, positive, no symptoms required. As Dr. Mullis put it, the PCR technique can find almost anything in anybody. The PCR test uses amplification cycles to find viral RNA. The sample is repeatedly chemically amplified to increase the RNA copies until they can be detected. Each cycle of amplification doubles the number of molecules in a sample. If you run long enough cycles, you can effectively find a single molecule of any substance. But is this clinically significant? Not according to many studies that confirm PCR results by culturing virus from samples, a technique not practical for widespread testing. These studies indicate that if the machine must run more than 25 to 35 cycles to get the sample to the test's limit of detection, there isn't enough virus in the sample to matter clinically. So Basically, if you had to run it from 25 to 35 cycles, it's not clinically significant. And yet, many of the PCR tests that are being used throughout the country and in fact the world run as many as 40 cycles and sometimes higher. Hey, what's up? How you doing? Good to see you. On top of the threshold issue is the tests don't look for the complete RNA strand. Instead, they test for 1, 2, or 3 genetic sequences. Tests that look only for 1 sequence are less accurate than those that look for 2 or 3, even if the CT value is reported. The value is often often an average of the values for the different gene sequences instead of a number of cycles needed to detect each sequence. So in a PCR test, they're testing for 3 different RNA sequences, right? And if say they only had to do 10 cycles to find one of the RNA sequences, and that's the RNA sequence for the common cold, right? But then they had to do 45 cycles to find the sequence that is in relation to SARS. Instead of reporting that this one only took 10 cycles, this one took 40 cycles, they average the two and say that the test used 30 cycles, and that's the CT score. And by doing that, they're also hiding inside of the numbers how many cycles they're having to do in order to get somebody to test positive with the cycle threshold. Also, everyone who shows up at the hospital for any reason is tested with no CT information. If positive, they are counted as CV hospitalization. Even fatalities are inflated, as many jurisdictions only require a positive test anytime in 1 to 2 months before death to flag someone as a CV fatality. So a binary positive-negative PCR test regime with no quantitative information inflates CV numbers from cases to hospitals to deaths. CT data is simply not reported. Many labs claim they don't even keep them. Yeah, right. It took a FOIA request from an intrepid member of riffreedom.org to finally uncover data from Rhode Island State Health Laboratory spanning March through June of 2020. If this Rhode Island data is at all representative, there is a lot to be learned from PCR tests and CT scores. First, we take a look at each individual positive test plotted as CT score versus date of test. The pandemic hit Rhode Island hard in the spring, and this data covers that period. Note the color code that indicates which of these positive tests may have been truly infections versus not infections, or cold positives. One can argue where exactly to draw these lines, but the point is clear that a great number of positive tests represented cold, non-infectious individuals. So basically everything in the yellow and green represented somebody who was not infectious, and they had to do way too many cycle thresholds in order to make them positive. We can see that nearly half of the positive tests had CT scores greater than 32. Meaning they were probably not infectious. Only 42% were likely infectious, and this is during a time when Rhode Island was smack in the middle of the spring pandemic, and when they were mainly testing symptomatic people. So this is before they were even testing asymptomatic people. Note that Rhode Island's case hospitalization death matrix peaked right near the end of April, which corresponds to the large jump in non-infectious CT scores in May versus April. Now it gets even more interesting. Let's look at the daily mean CT scores by date. And as you can see, by date, from March 20th to June 12th, as time went on, the people who were testing positive, represented by a dot on this matrix, they were less and less infectious as time went on. So according to the reporting we were all getting, that positive test results and positive infections were rising. The reality of the fact is that the cycle threshold that it was taking to find those samples was also rising significantly. From the 17th of April all the way to the 12th of June, everybody who tested on this graph was non-infectious. And all they were told was, you're positive. As May approaches, the average CT score of positive tests rises linearly through the maybe infectious zone into the non-infectious zone, again showing clearly that viral loads were decreasing, fewer people were actually sick. Finally, we overlay fatalities. We can clearly see the potential predictive effect of CT score trends relative to pandemic severity. In the graph below, daily fatalities have been offset by 21 days, shifted 21 days earlier than the actual date of death, to better align with infection date. And as you can see, as time went on, the more times they had to run CT values, the less infectious people became, and as you can trace with this red line, the fatalities fell with it. It is frankly negligent that officials and quote experts on both sides of pandemic policy are ignoring or cannot access this data. Labs simply don't provide them, apparently, because they are not required to do so. Isn't that just convenient? Guys, I don't believe in this kind of convenient negligence anymore. Beyond informing a tested individual regarding the severity of infection, or if there is even an infection at all, the distribution of CT scores in any given time period provides information that clearly has predictive value in gauging pandemic severity. Yet CT values are nearly impossible to obtain. And see, that's what makes it so crazy, is that this isn't just a statistic that they're hiding from people so that they can just give you a binary yes-no answer to your PCR test. But it's a data point that we can use predictively to actually benefit us in this pandemic that we're in. So why on earth would they be hiding it? Well, if you look here at the WHO's website on January 13th, 2021, and you guys know that I've been talking about how changing a narrative or shifting perception is like shifting a boat, and you have to turn early and you have to wait on it to turn. Well, they were already moving in the direction of pulling us out of this dark winter because the hero Joe Biden had been elected. And as you can see, I've made episodes showing example about this. But here on January 13th, the WHO makes a very interesting guidance update, and this is what they do. The WHO reminds IVD users that disease prevalence alerts the predictive value of test results. As disease prevalence decreases, the risk of false positives increases. This means that the probability that a person who has a positive result is truly infected with SARS-CoV-2 decreases as prevalence decreases, irrespective of the claim specifically. So what they're saying is exactly what I showed you in those graphs. As more and more of these people test positive with high cycle thresholds, the disease prevalence is going down. The WHO guidance diagnostic testing for SARS-CoV-2 states that careful interpretation of weak positive results is needed. Well, I'm glad they've decided that that's needed now as of January 13th. Number one, the cycle threshold needed to detect virus is inversely proportional to the patient's viral load. Well, isn't that nice to know now? Where test results do not correspond with the clinical presentation, a new specimen should be taken and a retesting using the same or different NAT technology. Basically saying if it doesn't work out this way, if it's not inversely proportional, you screwed up the test. So the WHO, all of a sudden now, they care about the CT results. And what is this going to do? This isn't a change in people. This isn't a change in sickness or spread of disease. This is just a change in statistics that's going to completely change the numbers going forward. It did mention in the article that there was one area that had a governor that forced their state to report CT results, and I could we could all make a guess what state that was and what governor that was, and it was Florida and Governor DeSantis. And as soon as he found out, look at him ahead of the curve, December 3rd, He came down here and told them right here in this specific alert in Florida that cycle threshold values and their reference ranges as applicable must be reported by laboratories to the FDOH via electronic laboratory reporting or by fax immediately. He was on to the game, and he knew that a binary yes-no answer to these PCR tests was just a way to fudge the numbers. All right. So that's it, guys. That is cycle threshold and how they are kind of fudging the numbers on the PCR test. I hope that helps some people. Whenever this gets done spooling, I'll put links to all the web pages that I used in the presentation below. And yeah, keep an eye on this, guys. All right, I'll talk to you guys later. Love y'all.